Hey guys, we are back continuing this trend of chef rankings we're doing for Hell's Kitchen, and today we're doing one for season 3, the last of the old school seasons in terms of the shorter seasons. And I found this to be a pretty interesting list to put together. There were some interesting players to assess. Now, before we get started, I should clarify that obviously I'm only going to be talking about the 12 chefs that we really get to see on the show. I will not be including JR, the 13th player that was added onto the season, only to be removed before the first dinner service and edited out of the show entirely. So again, I'm just going to be looking at the 12 players that we actually have information on. But with all that out of the way, we have 12 players to talk about, and not to waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, the player I believe did the worst on this season was a bit of a toss-up in my eyes. I actually shuffled between a couple different people, but at number 12, I actually decided to be a bit bold here, and actually we have Vinnie. And Vinny is an interesting case as he obviously made it further than some people will be talking about in a moment, but I also feel like he has no redeeming qualities to his game, both from a cooking perspective, but also from a social perspective. Right off the bat, he has a pretty bad signature dish, which by itself isn't too bad, but then he gets into an argument with Gordon on the mat, which obviously leaves a bad impression on Gordon. And then moving forward, he follows it up with a pretty bad service where he ends up running out of stock at one point, which results in him wanting to put water in the risotto. He even gets kicked out of his station and put on dishes instead. And while his team wins that first service, he gets called up by Gordon after that service, and he once again shows some attitude towards Ramsay, which is pretty bad. Episode 2, he has 0 good cuts in the challenge, which is pretty bad. But then he follows it up with a pretty bad service where he ends up lying to Ramsay about a dish not being burned when it very obviously was. And again, Gordon calls him out again for not being honest there. Service 3 is also bad where he makes a pretty big mistake and Gordon declares him untrustworthy. And then in episode 4, he has another really bad service where he just screws up Wellington after Wellington. And considering his bad relationship with Ramsay, it was just destined that he would go home, to the point where Ramsay goes out of his way to nominate him so that he can go home there. So all that's pretty bad. So obviously Vinny does make it further than some people will be talking about in a moment, but I feel like mixing in his pretty bad services plus his actively bad relationship with Ramsay, he really had no shot of getting too far in the game, which is why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I actually had this person at the bottom when I first put this list together, but after thinking about some more, I actually think this person has a couple pros going for them, and we actually have Aaron. And Aaron is someone who straight up was not cut out to play Hell's Kitchen, as he very much struggled during his brief time there, and yet he somehow made it to episode 3, where we really see him struggle during both of these services that he participates in, where obviously he makes a bevy of mistakes across both those services. We see him in episode 2 being assigned to tableside, but even then has a lot of trouble getting through that, where it took him 15 minutes to fillet a fish, and even then he left some bones within it. He was also shown being very emotional, where he would break down multiple times due to the pressure of it all, and while some of it can be due to him struggling medically, kind of similar to Larry from season 2, I feel like at the end of the day, Aaron was someone who was not really cut out to play the game and really had no shot of making it too deep into the game. But I will say there are two main pros to Aaron. One is he actually had a pretty good signature dish where while Gordon calls it out for having too many things on it, he actually did all right there. And I think the other thing which really elevates Aaron on this list is that despite all of his flaws, he actually seemed to be pretty well liked. And I feel like that likability translated to him lasting as long as he did. Where we see in episode 2 that despite him very obviously being the weakest link on the blue team, he somehow is not nominated there, which is pretty insane. And I think we even see that with Ramsay, where Ramsay never gets that upset at Aaron either, where we see him being pretty sympathetic towards Aaron despite all of his struggles. We see him calming Aaron down whenever he has one of his breakdowns. And when Aaron has to leave the game due to his medical issues, we see Ramsay feeling pretty bad for him. And we even see in season 4 that Aaron is brought back for a reward. So you can clearly tell that Ramsay liked Aaron a lot. And I feel like had he stayed in the game, that he probably would have been given a couple more chances based off that likability alone. So I think those things were enough to keep him off the bottom of the list for me. But at the end of the day, I feel like he had very little potential within the game, which is why he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we are finally at the first boot of the season, and here we have Tiffany. And I think in a lot of ways, Tiffany's your standard first boot, where she has a pretty bad first service, where she's put on appetizers, but she really holds up the kitchen with her continuing to screw up the quail eggs, not really knowing how to make eggs. And despite Julia offering to help her at several points, Tiffany just completely shuts out Julia due to her background of working at the Waffle House. So I feel like that prejudice really held her back, and I feel like it's a big reason why Ramsay does eliminate her, where she finds her like closed-minded and unwilling to accept help from others. So I find that pretty bad. Again, in a lot of ways, it's a game similar to Vinnie's, but I will say the main thing keeping her above Vinnie and Aaron is that she at least had a good signature dish, which is a step above Vinnie. She also didn't actively burn Ramsay as much as Vinnie did. And I feel like compared to Aaron, she at least had more potential within the game compared to Aaron, who, again, was just not cut out to handle the pressure of Hell's Kitchen. I feel like had Tiffany survived this first round, I could have seen her having more of a deep run compared to those two. But at the end of the day, she is still the first boot, which is why she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Eddie. And in a lot of ways, Eddie's run isn't as remarkable as the people we already talked about. Now, he does have a really bad signature dish where he puts up raw scallops. I feel like that kind of let the bad impression in Ramsay's eyes. But I will say that his first service is actually kind of fine, where he doesn't really make too many mistakes during that. It's really not until service 2 where his game really unravels, where he makes a whole bunch of mistakes that results in him being kicked off his station. And obviously his entire team had a pretty bad service to where they ended up getting kicked out of the kitchen. But I will also say that he wasn't the obvious boot from his team either, where I feel like Aaron or Vinnie easily could have gone home in that service. And I feel like he kind of just got unlucky with the nominations during that service anyway. But I feel like with Eddie making fewer active mistakes than the people we already talked about, I did decide to leave him a little bit higher. But at the end of the day, he is still only the second boot of the season, which is why he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we are continuing with the boot order, and here we have Joanna. And I feel like Joanna was another pretty bad chef, where rather bad, she has a bad signature dish. She has his pretty notable moment of including a drink with her signature dish, only for Gordon to hand it back to her. That was pretty funny. She has a pretty mediocre service 1, where she ends up getting nominated due to her not working well with Melissa, but she's able to scrape through that. Service 2 is also not great, where she ends up holding up the kitchen and Melissa has to take over her station, but they end up winning that service, so whatever. And then we get to her boot round, where she makes a pretty fatal mistake by using spoiled crab in the middle of her station, which causes Gordon to kick her out. And that is the main reason she is eliminated, where it's obviously a health hazard at that point. Not to mention that this is the same round where Jen had taken spaghetti out of the trash and used it. So I think that really speaks to the magnitude of Joanna's mistake here. But even beyond that, her run is just so mediocre, and there's not really much to praise about it, that I had to leave her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have a pretty notorious chef in Hell's Kitchen history, but we actually have Josh, the first black jacket on the board. And again, Josh's run is pretty mediocre. Right off the bat, you have a bad signature dish, what do you expect? And while his service isn't terrible, he obviously has this moment where he runs out of chicken, which isn't great. Service 2 is more actively bad, where he makes a bevy of mistakes there on the meat station, screwing up dish after dish. He also lies to Gordon about the chicken not being dry when it was, and he ends up on the block, largely due to Rock not liking him, but he ends up surviving that. Service 3 is a little better, but even then, like, he has that moment where he tells Brad he's not ready for an order, which causes Ramsay to accuse him of sabotage, but they end up winning that service, so whatever. Service 4, he ends up going 0 for 3 on the blind taste test, which is pretty bad, and he follows it up with another bad service where he makes several mistakes. We even see a customer bringing back one of his dishes, which is a bad look. And while Ramsay later saves him by overruling Rock's nomination of him, I feel like a lot of that was due to Vinnie being a much bigger nuisance to Ramsay at that point, to where Ramsay felt the need to address that situation right then and there. Service 5 is also pretty bad, where Brad has to take over his station, and even then he screws up several dishes, but is able to avoid nomination there. Service 6 is also pretty mediocre, and while he ends up staying, we literally see Gordon calling him out for being the only chef left in the game at that point that has not had a single single good service. Service 7 is also really bad, where he makes a bevy of mistakes there. He easily could have gone home with that service, but he somehow avoids nomination. And then we get to the Black Jackets, which is a notoriously bad service for Josh, where he makes mistake after mistake, and Ramsey has enough, and he decides to eliminate Josh right then and there, making Josh the first person to ever be eliminated in the middle of service. So obviously Josh is a pretty bad chef. The fact that he made it to Black Jackets is a bit of an anomaly, and while he is nominated 3 times before his eventual boot, realistically he probably could have been nominated a 4th or 5th time and could have gone home at any of those services before his eventual boot. And I feel like with him clearly being the weakest link of the Black Jackets, I did decide to leave him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we are just rounding out the pre-Black Jacket boots. But at number 6, I did decide to go with Melissa. And I think Melissa is a pretty interesting player to look at. Right off the bat, she actually has one of the better starts out of the players on the board, where she has a good signature dish, and she follows it up with a pretty good service where, while we see people on her team being annoyed by her leadership role, she does end up winning best of the worst at that service, which is pretty good there. Service 2 is also pretty good, where while we see more of her micromanagement of the team, she obviously does pretty well in that service there, and then service 3 is more of the same. I think service 4 is when we start to see things going downhill, where she ends up getting nominated after a pretty bad service, largely due to her team's annoyance at her. And while Ramsey does overrule this nomination, I feel like she continues to do poorly in episode 5, where we see her being overbearing during the challenge. We even see Gordon getting annoyed by her when she tries to stop her team from serving the dishes during the challenge, which obviously leads to the infamous moment of them putting up a overcooked duck, which is pretty embarrassing. And she follows it up with another pretty bad service where she is nominated once again, and she's obviously sent over to the blue team. Gordon even says to her that this is her last chance. And then service 6 isn't much better, where she continues to make more mistakes, and it gets so bad that Gordon eliminates her before the nominations even take place. So in a lot of ways, I find her run here to be pretty similar to that of Rachel's from season 2, where she started off as a pretty strong figure on her team, being this clear leader, only for her to go downhill as the expectations got higher and higher. And I feel like in some ways, Melissa played the leadership role worse than Rachel, where even early on we saw her team being annoyed by her leadership, and that issue just got worse and worse until her entire team was against her, and even Ramsey was getting annoyed by her for being overbearing. But I will say that she at least won at best of the worst, and I feel like she was a better chef overall than Josh, which is a big reason that I have her above him at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have the highest ranked pre-Black Jacket boot, and that person is Brad, the final boot before the Black Jackets. And I think Brad's run is pretty much middle of the road, where right off the bat he has a bad signature dish. What do you expect for this point in Hell's Kitchen history? And while he doesn't really make any mistakes during service 1, he doesn't really stand out too much outside of helping Vinnie on the appetizers after he struggles with that. Service 2 is kind of the same, where he is once again put on appetizers after Eddie messes that up, but even then, like, we see him making a mistake with the risotto, and obviously that service itself is pretty bad for his team. Service 3 has him also taking over for Aaron on the omelet station, but even then he makes a mistake there, and then he volunteers to be the leader for the blue team during the service, only to have a pretty bad service himself, where he overcooks a Wellington, and Gordon even calls him out for his poor performance during the service, but he's able to avoid nomination there. Service 4, he's just kind of there. And then service 5, we once again see him helping out Josh on the risotto during the service, but even then he annoys Gordon when he's supposed to be on the meat station. And then I think his final 2 services are pretty bad, where he makes several mistakes across them, where in service 6 he ends up not boiling the water before putting spaghetti in it, he screws up the risotto, he puts up too many orders at once, and he is nominated here by Gordon, but he's spared from that. And then we get to his boot round, where he is responsible for every item on the menu for that service, but it leads to pretty bad results, where he ends up screwing up his own orders. Customers are sending orders back, which is a bad look. Gordon calls him out for not helping Josh when Josh is struggling, and he's eventually put up for being a bad leader, and at that point he is eventually taken out. I feel like in a lot of ways Brad's run is similar to that in Melissa's, where you can clearly tell that he was more of a leader figure for his team than anyone else. And while he doesn't really stand out as much as Melissa, I feel like he manages the leadership role a bit better, where obviously we see more points of the team receiving his leadership well. He's obviously not nominated as much as Melissa. And while he doesn't have the same high of winning a best of the worst, I feel like his more consistent run was enough to have him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we are down to the final 4, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And kind of similar to season 2, we actually have a finalist at this spot, and here we have Bonnie, the runner-up of the season. And very similar to Virginia, while Bonnie does make it to the end, I find her run there to be also pretty mediocre. Right off the bat, she has a pretty bad start, having a bad signature dish, really highlighting her lack of professional cooking experience, and that's followed up in the first service where she doesn't know how to cook quail eggs, which is pretty bad. We then get to episode 2 where she fails to score a single point for her team despite producing many cuts for that challenge, which is pretty bad. And she has another pretty bad service there where Gordon ends up calling her a dumb blonde. Service 3 is also bad where she ends up making raw scallops, and Gordon even says that this is the last time he's gonna trust her. We then get to the blind taste test in episode 4 where, while she does pretty well there, getting 2 out of 3 on that, we even see the blue team accusing her of cheating after she claims that she was able to hear Gordon before the test even started. And then the following service is pretty bad where she ends up putting a piece of chicken on the pan after she sliced it. She makes multiple mistakes during the service, and she even gets emotional afterwards where she wants to go home, and she's even nominated by Ramsay due to her being the worst performer on the red team the first time all season that she's nominated, even though there's a serious debate for her being nominated in the earlier services had she had the opportunity. And I feel like she largely gets saved by the fact that both teams had to put on nominees during this elimination, and Vinnie was such a nuisance to Ramsay that he felt the need to eliminate him there. Service 5 is also pretty bad, where she makes a couple of mistakes there, and while Melissa was the bigger target by the red team at that point, she still put up as a pawn the second time in a row that she was nominated. Service 6 is probably her best service up to this point, but it's still not great, where she does have a fire breaking out her station at one point, but she also had an item on the menu which definitely helped her team out there. But then she follows it up with another pretty bad service where she has this bacon wrapped rabbit leg on the menu that her team doesn't know how to make, but even then she makes a couple of mistakes and she ends up getting nominated for the third time of the season. And there was a serious argument for her going home at this point, considering that she was a far less consistent chef than Brad, and she's even blindsided when she is saved over Brad. So that's not great. And then we get to the Black Jackets, where she does actually have a pretty good service 8, where she ends up winning best of the worst, which essentially guarantees her a spot in the final 3. I think she does pretty well during the final 3, where while I still think Jen was the better chef in that point, I feel like she did well enough at the hot plate to justify her spot in the final 3. And then, kind of similar to Virginia, I think she does put up a decent fight against Rock, where she ends up winning the popular vote challenge. But I also think she was harmed by the fact that her team simply didn't like her, where we saw like Julia not wanting to work with her and her team just not taking her seriously for a lot of it. So I feel like by the end it makes sense why she loses to Rock, but I still think she did about as well as she could have at that point. So I think in a lot of ways, Bonnie's game is pretty similar to that of Virginia's, where she very rarely does anything too impressive over the course of the season. I find her to be a very inconsistent chef at points. And you also have the fact that she was nominated 3 times over the course of the season, one of which she easily could have gone home, and there are plenty of other points where she could have gone up as well. So I feel like for all those reasons, I can't really praise her game too much. I feel like I would have her relatively low on a runner-up ranking. So despite her placement on the season, I did decide to leave her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we are sticking with someone who didn't quite make it to the end, but still had a somewhat impressive run, and here we have Julia. And obviously Julia has a pretty interesting run over the course of the season. Right off the bat, we see her not doing super well at her first service, and obviously a lot of that comes down to people not wanting to help her, and people like Tiffany completely shutting her out due to her working at the Waffle House, and we even see Tiffany wanting to target her at that first service, but she's able to avoid nomination there. We then get to service 3, where we see her taking on a leadership role during the challenge and the breakfast service, and we even see her continuing this during the service, where she takes over for Joanna after Joanna's kicked out the fish station. She's also the one to stop Jen from using the trash spaghetti, and obviously that's pretty good. But despite this, she's still nominated after the service due to people just being prejudiced against her prior experience, where due to her like working at the Waffle House versus a fine dining establishment, people just assume that she doesn't know all these finer details, despite the fact that she did pretty well in this service. And we even see that where Ramsey decides to take her off the block after she's nominated. And while service 4 isn't great where she overcooks some scallops, I think service 5 is pretty good where we even see Gordon complimenting her during the service. That's pretty good. Service 6 isn't great where we do actually see her making a mistake at one point, and she actually gets pretty emotional in the middle of service, which is pretty bad, but she's able to avoid nomination there. And then we get to service 7, which ends up being her best service of the season, where she gets a best of the worst there. Again, a lot of good stuff there. And then we get to service 8, the first round of the Blackjack Kids, which ends up being her boot round due to Josh getting ejected and her being the least experienced chef of the final 4. But even then, we see her winning the challenge with 51% of the vote. And while she doesn't make too many mistakes during the service, I feel like Ramsey kind of saw her as not keeping up, that she was starting to give up after all this time. And obviously that leads to her elimination. But I still find that compared to Bonnie, she played a more impressive game. I feel like Julia as a whole had a stronger performance than Bonnie throughout a lot of the season. And I feel like had Bonnie not had as good of a service there, or had they not decided to go through with an elimination after Josh got ejected, I think Julia has a very good shot at making it to the final 3. And granted, while I think Jen and Rock are better chefs than her, I feel like Julia's overall performance was a step above that of Bonnie's. So because of that, I have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I kind of did spoil the top 2. But number 2, I do have Jen. And I feel like Jen is up there as one of the more impressive chefs of the season. We're right at the bat, we have her having a pretty good start with those first 2 services. And yeah, while there are things to point out, like her having a bad signature dish and her having 0 points in that episode 2 challenge, I think her services there are pretty solid. But then we get to service 3, where obviously she makes a notorious mistake of taking the spaghetti out of the trash, washing it, and trying to use it in an order. And obviously, while she is stopped before Gordon notices this, she follows it up by feeling really guilty about it. And we even see her volunteering herself for the block when she really didn't need to. And I guess you could say that this endears her to Ramsey, to where Ramsey gives her another shot, but realistically, she could have gotten away with that without too much issue. But I feel like she recovers pretty well from this, where in service 4, she ends up winning best of the worst, which is pretty good. But even then, she does annoy Ramsey that she doesn't put up Bonnie in that spot, instead putting up Melissa, causing Ramsey to later put up Bonnie instead. And then we get to episode 5, where while she has the whole duck mishap during the challenge, she follows it up with a pretty good service, winning best of the worst yet again. This time she does put up Melissa and Bonnie. Service 6 is kind of fine, but then service 7 is pretty mediocre, where while she doesn't make too many mistakes during that challenge, she obviously gets called up by Ramsey for not really doing much of anything in that service, which is pretty bad. We then get to the Blackjack Kids, which is a mostly solid service from her, but even then there's a point where she feels like Rock is undercutting her. And then we get to her boot round at the final 3, where she does technically win the challenge there in a 3-0-0 vote. And then we get to the service where she doesn't do too terribly in the service, where yeah, she does make some mistakes, like letting Scott serve spaghetti with no crab, and then while she's cooking, she ends up screwing up a risotto. But I still feel like she was a better chef than Bonnie and probably deserved a spot in the final 2 over her, but I feel like it's largely that service that leads to her elimination there. So I feel like on the whole, Jen is a pretty solid chef during the season, where despite her making that one massive mistake during episode 3, I feel like she recovers pretty well from it and ends up having a pretty solid run during the season, but obviously comes up just short of the end, which is why she's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the chef I believe played the best on Hell's Kitchen Season 3 is the winner of the season, and here we have Rock. And I feel like Rock's game is pretty interesting, definitely similar to that of Heather's in a lot of way, where while I don't think it's the most dominant in the world, I feel like he still played a mostly solid game. Rather bad, he obviously has a bad first impression with Ramsey, where he uses frozen ingredients in his signature dish, which is pretty bad. But again, I feel like he does pretty well in that first service. Service 2 is also pretty strong, where he obviously wins best of the worst after a strong service. Though he does make a bit of an interesting move, where rather than going for the easy target in Aaron, he actually decides to try and target Josh, who he sees as a bigger competitor down the line. And obviously this ends up backfiring, which annoys Josh down the road, but he's still able to perform well, where he does well in service 3. We see him winning best of the worst again in episode 4, where he once again tries to nominate Josh, only to backfire, and we even see Ramsey getting annoyed by him for not putting up the worst performer there, who we saw as Vinnie. but he's still able to scrape through that situation. We then get to service 5, where he does technically screw up a dish with Melissa, and while Melissa tries to throw him under the bus, it doesn't really work, and Rock is still able to remain in good graces there. Then we get to episode 6, where this is obviously the episode where he has his whole freak out after losing the challenge, and obviously while that's a bad look, he still follows it up with a pretty good service where he ends up taking over from Melissa on the fish station. Then we get to service 7, where he does okay in the service, but even then, Ramsey calls him out for not helping Josh. Then we get to the Black Jackets, which is probably the worst service we've seen up to this point by a winner, where he ends up making several mistakes during that service. We also see Bonnie trying to throw him under the bus, and in general, he shows a lot of attitude in this service where he ends up getting into arguments with the rest of the team, and all of it culminates with him getting nominated. The first time that a winner had been nominated, which is obviously pretty bad, but he's able to get through that situation. Then we get to the final 3, where admittedly he doesn't do that well in the service, where while he does notice Scott left the ham out of a dish, he obviously struggles to push out the orders in a timely manner, but I feel like with Jen having the worst service, he ends up scraping through that. And then we get to the final service, where I think he does decently enough to win. Mind you, I feel like he was the clear frontrunner at that point over Bonnie, but I feel like he definitely played the service better than Heather did, to where it makes sense why he eventually wins. Again, I feel like Brock is a pretty interesting winner to assess, and I feel like on a winner ranking, I feel like he's around the same ballpark as Heather. I'm kind of conflicted over which one is above the other, but I still find Rock to be a mostly solid winner of the show, and clearly the best chef from the season, which is why he's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week with more videos like this, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.